So our mission as a church is to introduce people to Jesus, together fully follow him. From a communication standpoint, we really believe then in partnering with that mission through problem solving that leads to inspiring and informing. And so how can we create solutions to problems that our ministry teams have that really can inspire and inform our attendees, those that we currently have and those that we haven't met yet, towards that mission statement.
Welcome to the 147th episode of the Missional Marketing Podcast. This is season 4, episode 23. My name is Bart Blair. I'm the co-host of the show. And I want to thank you for tuning in to another episode of our podcast. I say another, assuming that this is a return visit for you or a repeat listen. If that is you, we thank you for being loyal to our show. If you haven't subscribed wherever you're listening, make sure that you do that. And if you haven't ever left us a rating or a review wherever you listen to the show, we'd love for you to do that as well. You know how the algorithms of the internet work. And the more you review and rate our podcast, the more people find it. And we just want to share the love with as many people as we possibly can. If you happen to be new to the show, maybe you're a pastor, maybe you're a church communications director, maybe you're a volunteer in your church, maybe in some way, shape, or form, you're responsible for the marketing, the communications, the digital outreach, however you want to shape it, maybe all of the above. You've come to the right place. We create this podcast really to try to be as practical and helpful to you as we can. At Missional Marketing, we help churches leverage their digital footprint to reach more people for Jesus. And we started this podcast in 2020 with the hopes of being able to take some of the lessons that we're learning and to be able to share them on a broader scale with people all across the country, maybe even across the world, who could learn a few things from some of the leaders that we get to rub shoulders with from time to time. So that's what this podcast is all about. And today's episode is absolutely no different. Today's guest is Joanna Wishard from a church called Lcbc. Now, you may not be familiar with Lcbc. If you're outside of Pennsylvania, very good chance you never heard of this church, but you're missing out. I spent a little bit of time in Pennsylvania from time to time doing ministry work. And one thing that I've noticed is that, well, when you're in central Pennsylvania, there's an Lcbc location on just about every corner. They have over 22 locations and growing. A very large church. Not every campus is a large campus, but they have a very, very large footprint in the state of Pennsylvania, making a great impact for God's kingdom there. And Joanna, as part of the marketing communications team at Lcbc, she's got a very, very full plate. And we're privileged that she gave us a little bit of her time to be a guest on our show. Unfortunately for me, after taking like 8 months to get Joanna scheduled for the show, she said yes, and then we just had scheduling conflict after scheduling conflict. I got sick and wasn't able to actually be on this episode. Isn't that the way that it works out? But my co-host, Jason Hamrock, the CEO of Missional Marketing, did a great job interviewing Joanna, and I think you're going to learn a ton from this content. So thanks again for being a listener to our show. If you happen to be watching on our YouTube channel, we'd love to engage with you there, so you can leave a comment on our YouTube channel. All that being said, we're really proud in what we've been able to build with this podcast over the last few years, and we want to thank you for being along for the ride with us. So without any further delay, here's Jason Hamrock, the CEO of Missional Marketing, and from Lcbc Church, Joanna Wishard.
Well, hey, Joanna, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Good. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, glad to have you here. I know you're busy. Your world is crazy busy, got a lot going on. So we appreciate you taking a few minutes to jump into communications types of conversations here and just kind of go with us in that. So for our audience, give us a little background as to who you are and of course, your role and all the things you get to oversee.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a part of Lcbc Church. We are located in Pennsylvania, kind of central PA, mostly on the east side. We are at 22 locations and counting, which is really exciting. Yeah. So I've been on staff with our church about 7 going on 8 years. And so kind of funny, I went to school for graphic design. In school, actually, I started working retail. Graduated, didn't actually get into design right away, and just actually was in retail management for a bunch of years.
Okay.
That was out in Minneapolis, relocated back to the East Coast to be closer to family. And then actually started attending Lcbc. And so my husband and I got super involved in our student ministry and just loved what the church was doing, loved the mission statement. And so kind of through a bunch of just relationships and conversations, started freelancing. That turned into joining the team as a designer. And so, yeah, now a couple of years later, have the opportunity to lead as the communications director.
Okay, so interesting
Yeah,
path.
totally.
What made you want to jump into the role as the director?
Yeah, so it's funny because I just love what I get to do. I loved being on the communications team. I love serving our ministry areas. And so in our context, our team works to serve all locations and central ministry teams.
Okay.
And so our team is really a team of teams. So disciplines would include graphic design, video, project management, and marketing.
Yeah.
And I mean, truthfully, just love working with the team. We have incredible just gifts and talents. And so fun to actually have that like retail leadership, creativity, all kind of combine. And just as our organization is sizing and scaling, just was like, okay, yeah, I think I can do this. I think I can take on this challenge. And so, yeah, I love being a part of the team, love doing what I get to do.
Yeah, that's a big challenge, 22 campuses. So how do you balance that idea of trying to keep, because that's overwhelming. If all of them were running wild, that would just be impossible. That'd be like 22 different clients. That would be crazy.
Sure.
So how do you balance organizing that with being able to be creative for each campus, or how does that roll out?
Yeah, totally. So I would say a couple of years ago, we actually read the book Predictable Success as an organization. And so really started asking ourselves the hard questions around, hey, is church scalable? What does that mean for us? What does that mean for our context and how we want to keep growing to introduce people to Jesus, together fully follow him, right? And so I think through that process, a lot of refining around systems, processes, what were our differentiators, what was important to us, and then really trying to hone in on like good versus best. And so I think where we are today, we did a lot of work to work through what the book describes as whitewater, and just realized like, hey, some of these things are not efficient, that they can be more efficient. And sometimes we also just need to work through like kind of what's good versus best and create systems and processes to support that. And so in our context, we kind of work through a model where campuses and central work together. And so from a central perspective, it's our job to provide processes, products, and training to help our campus teams, lead their people, and execute kind of that core differentiator with excellence. And so, yes, 22 campuses kind of doing their thing in their context, but all kind of foundationally built under the same processes, products, and training. And then how do we just help nuance when nuance needs to happen? So talk a little bit then about the mission, because you've talked a little bit about that here, and how do you then, because everything has to be aligned around the mission. If it doesn't fit the mission, we don't do it, kind of a thing. Totally.
Right? And so what's kind of cool about that is all 22 campuses are underlined one mission. So how does communications see that, take that mission, and how do they implement that into what you do?
Yeah. So our mission as a church is to introduce people to Jesus, together fully follow him. From a communication standpoint, we really believe then in partnering with that mission through problem solving that leads to inspiring and informing. And so how can we create solutions to problems that our ministry teams have that really can inspire and inform our attendees, those that we currently have and those that we haven't met yet, towards that mission statement, and just how they engage at our church, how they see themselves at our church, to make sure that from the minute we meet them, whether digitally or physically, to the moment they join us on a weekend and everything in between, that it feels just like a very consistent, welcoming, all the things that kind of emulate who we are, kind of from start to finish.
Wow, that's a tall order.
But it's really fun.
It's and you live inside systems.
Yeah.
Right. So you otherwise it would be really, really probably stressful. But what are some of those? Talk a little bit about the joys that you see from your job, and then I'll switch to talk about like what are the things you want to work on.
Yeah. So I would say what's cool, and actually even a little systemy, if you will, is we just realized a couple years ago, we just had to hone in on our creative process. And so what's cool is seeing a ton of fruit then from some of that really hard work to figure out what are systems and structures that can hold what we need to do, but also remain flexible and nimble to ministry. It would be really easy to say, oh, just systematize everything. But that's when people quickly are like, well, how much time do you need to get a project done? And it's like, well, that's not the posture, right? And so it's fun to see now a lot of the work that we have done that it's just, I feel like, paying off for us. And so whether that's through building relational equity, through talking about like that discovery part of the project, what are you trying to do? How can we help you? What problem are you trying to solve? To then also like the other side where it's like the execution, the delivery, to really start seeing life change happen and hear stories from what our work is doing and how it's helping people. And so the best day is when we get a story in Slack that says, hey, you'd never believe this. Someone came to our church for the first time and just said they found us on Google. And so I know that that's our team helping make sure that we can show up well in those spaces and get to people wherever they are on their journey. And so when you go through all that work to find the right systems and processes and service culture, then it's like, cool. The stories are like, then the sweet spot of like, awesome guys, like it's paying off. And like, that's amazing.
What's it been like to try and capture, like hearing that somebody came to church through Google or whatever? That's awesome. I love that kind of stuff. How have you built that culture so there's that feedback from ministries and 22 campuses of ministries?
Yeah. So really practically speaking, we have a stories channel, and so much of our culture is just a stories driven currency. And so how do we just make sure that we can share them and surface them? Now, it's funny as I feel like we've definitely kind of helped the tide move towards knowing how to share those stories and also fill in kind of that education gap for our teams that we even had hopefully something to do with that Google search. And so last year in particular, one of our organizational priorities was to expand and grow digital reach. And so we've done that through a ton of different ways. We launched a podcast last year. We've been kind of figuring out what is the right like search engine and like SEO stuff to like go down that. And so not to get too technical, but like what are some ways that we really can work to expand our digital reach? And then in all of our team meetings, that comes up. And so even our senior leader is sharing, hey guys, like we're seeing this is going right back to the priority. So then that also helps our staff know what to look for and listen for to also then I think share it back with us so we can celebrate those wins with them.
Yeah. Getting the senior leadership is incredibly important in that.
Yeah.
Right? I don't want people to overlook that because I think as comm directors or people that are in communications, we know that stories are some of the best fruit that you can try to capture and share with people, not only your people, but other people, right? They can see hope inside that story. And it's one thing for us as comm directors to try and push that and say, we really need that but it's another thing to have the leadership come in and say, this is just this is the fabric of who we are.
Yeah.
How did you know that? Or is that something like you had to go try and pitch, or is it just your leaders knew?
Yeah. So I would say that it's probably a combination of the two. I think when we can show up with using stories we've heard then that also just shares like, oh, like we can do that. Like, yeah, okay, I'll share stories with you because I know what you're going to do with them. And so I think some of that is like that leading up. But also I think some of that story sharing is just, again, part of our culture. And so I'm sure like a lot of churches, we have staff meetings where we're talking about logistics and what's coming down the pike. But we also make it a point to say, hey, what's God doing? And that really does open the floor then for our staff to just say, hey, what stories are you seeing? How are you seeing God work? And then our team tries to capture them and reshare them in meaningful ways. Again, sometimes just it might be internally among our teams, or sometimes it might be more outward on a weekend. But then I think even with 22 locations, they want their stories to be shared. And so it's fun then to have them share them back with us and say, hey, I think this would be a great story. And then for us to help them share that.
How do you run with those? And so when you capture a really good story, what's your process for what makes a good story versus, this is a really, really good story, or this is just a good story? And then
Yep.
what kind of channels are you pushing those out to? What's that look like?
Totally. So I think depending on the type of story and kind of what we're working on, and then kind of figuring out the right match between the two.
Okay.
And so we're on social media, YouTube, all that fun stuff. But then additionally, our weekend gatherings, we send weekly emails to our attendees kind of for like need to know at LCBC. And so really it's kind of matching the stories with those right platforms. And so there are definitely times, I mean, we just shared one this weekend, that the story was very integral to the message. And so that like was a great lineup of sharing someone's life change story with what was going on like within our weekend communicator. But then there are times where we'll just share a pull quote in our email and say, hey guys, as you know, we're in like a groups season, we'd love like get plugged into a group. Here's someone's story about they got plugged into a group and what's happened as a result. And so I think it's just matching the right story with the right channel and then kind of figuring out like the inspire and the inform and making sure that those two things go together, even when you're telling someone's story.
Yeah, that's so good. I think, yeah, some takeaways there is, well, first of all, just that culture of capturing stories and then knowing what to do with it. Now, how often, so if you get a good story, do you guys just go all out? Sometimes you just create a whole video that's showing on the weekend and
Yeah.
you're able to push that out everywhere?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we do have a great team of videographers who, a couple of them in particular, like they just live and breathe stories. And so how are they just hearing them? And then they have a great like pre-interview and even care process. Because, like when you share your story, that can be really vulnerable. A lot of times people start sharing stuff that they may not have even been expecting or anticipating to share as a result of that. And so the guys just do a great job of also caring for the person in that process.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times we will shoot stories to just kind of have them in the can, if you will. And then there are often times too where we'll actually be going and looking for something specific. We are very blessed with a lot of life change in our church. And so typically our attendees are also very eager to share what God's doing in their life. And even for the folks that are like, I don't know, I don't think I really have a story. A lot of times those are the ones that are like the most captivating. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, I say this to all the time is if your church is growing, that's an indication that God's moving in your church. And if God's moving in your church, stories are being created because life is being changed, right? And I think the key and the concept is you're not only wanting to energize your people, like and just give your own people like, oh, that's really cool, and just lifts people up. I think it goes way deeper than that. It helps people who don't go to your church, if you do this right, that they could see themselves in that situation and just find that there's hope. There's a God who loves them, who will see them through this storm that they're in.
Totally.
That's the stuff that you don't really realize how the Lord knows about this, but we don't necessarily, unless we tell us. But that's the cool stuff. I think that just that all that stuff that happens behind the scenes that we don't know about.
Yeah. And it's been incredible too. So with our two most recent campus launches, I want to say they were within the last 6 months of each other. The like external campaign we did around advertising really was then rooted in people's stories. And so I would say even that was probably the first time we even had the right stories to share in those contexts that, I mean, I think one of them like opens with just like, I didn't know what to do. I didn't feel like I had people around me. A friend invited me to church and like everything changed. It's like, my goodness, how like, like how easily is it to like see that, stop the scroll, relate to that, and then act on it? Yeah. And so it was really cool to see that team be able to launch a whole plan just really focused around people's stories and sharing that with others in their community.
Yeah. I love it. Love it. Thank you for sharing all that. Okay. Let's talk about the other side of that, which is what are some challenges that, being the comm director and your comm team that you're sort of facing?
Yeah. Can I say time? I feel like it's always just being up against the calendar. And so it's funny, right? Like I know I shared a minute ago, just good versus best. And that really is just a value that we try to hold, in that we could do a lot of really good things, but they might not be the best things. And so I'm very grateful that even our leadership has given us just very specific priorities, very specific just drivers of like what is differentiating and core to who we are. Sometimes we'll even refer to it as like the LCBC way, and just like, this is who we are. And we're unapologetic about that. And how do we make decisions through those filters? And so what can be challenging is when you have, whether it's a ministry or another location, that they're just really excited about this cool thing, or they really want to do this crazy thing that, seems really off the wall, and just kind of having to like pull the layers off that onion to get kind of to the problem, the thing under the thing usually. And then just make hard decisions around, hey, is that the right thing? Is that going, in the direction of our mission and our drivers and our, who we are? And when it's not, that leads to tough conversations. And so one of our values is to have the right conversations with the right person, the whole truth with grace. And so how do we really have that conversation and say, hey, this is what I'm hearing. This is what, feels like we need to kind of massage a little bit to figure out it's the right thing. And then one of our things is like, we just try to find a way to yes. And so that doesn't mean it might be the thing you start with, but that doesn't mean we can't serve you and help you get to the thing that you're trying to solve.
I love that you just said at the end, we always try and get to a yes, because I think sometimes as comm directors, we might just say, nope, you can't have that. It doesn't fit. And I'm not a big fan of that, because not that I don't want them to feel the rejection or that's just an uncomfortable situation. It's, you want to help them win.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it is just, the win is don't put your efforts in that. But I think it's always, but here's what we can do to help you. Totally. And sometimes it's just counseling, and some advice. Here's what you can do to go help your, event or whatever be successful.
Yeah. And I think so much of that can stem from coming to the table with solutions instead of coming to the table with problems. And so I think that's like a lot of work that just even a lot of folks at my, just like in my peer group at the church, like that's just what we keep trying to even sharpen each other with, where it's like, oh, it just sounds like you gave a solution, like reframe that, but tell me the problem. And so I think we've still have work to do, but that's the thing that we keep trying to bring back to each other, that it's like, nope, that's not a problem. That's a solution. And of course we want to make cool stuff, right? Of course we want to, do the trendy this or the cool that. But if it's not solving our problem, we also don't want to misalign using our resources.
Yeah. But let's talk a little bit about that, because you have to have a careful balance here. What is the priority to or time or energy based on Sundays versus everything else?
Yeah. Great question. So it's funny because I was processing that a little bit, even before our conversation today, and I don't know that we would describe it that way necessarily. And so, yes, we are in the week for the weekend. Absolutely. But more so through the filters, I think we operate. And then that naturally informs the weight to Sunday in all ministry environments. And so for us, we very much believe in relevant gatherings that are simple and applicable, dynamic kid and student ministries. We want our people for it to be easy to feel seen and known. And we want to blow away our people with personal care and follow through. And so a lot of that happens on a Sunday. Absolutely. But also a lot of that happens outside of Sunday. Yeah. And so when we're working on projects and intaking work and helping our ministries and our campuses, those probably are the higher level filters we think through, and then determine what priorities and projects look like from there.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, because you have a lot to deal with. I mean, with all those campuses, there's tons of ministries wanting stuff. So you could easily lose track of, I'm sure. Yeah. Like you said, time is your biggest thing that you have to.
Yeah, absolutely. And that does not mean that Sunday's not important, but I think it just also, what's the right way to say it? Like almost neutralizes it a little bit, that then every team, regardless of their ministry area, like we're all pointed towards the same drivers. We're all pointed towards the same mission. And so, yes, dynamic kid and student ministry, that's also a very high priority for us. Because we want parents to, we want their kids to have amazing experiences where they're telling their parents, I can't wait to come back. If we were just focused on the weekend gathering, those two things would be out of balance with one another.
Yeah. Yeah. So true. So true. What's some advice you would give to, a communication director who's fairly new to the role? Cause you're not too far, to new to the role. What kind of advice would you give them right now as they're stepping? Like, what's the things they should try to prioritize?
Yeah, for me, and probably the way I'm wired, relationships are just so important. And so for me, I love to get around people that I can ask a lot of questions to. I think understanding organizational history is really key, especially when you might even be seeing that you need to change directions or kind of turn the dial 10 or 15 degrees. The more you can do that with organizational history on your side, with other people in the room, kind of that you have relationships built with. I don't know. I just find that can be easier to work through those changes or challenges. And then also that you just have a great sounding board to process with. And so I know even my supervisor said to me once, hey, kind of the more you move through different leadership levels in a church, just the lonelier it can get. And so how do you just make sure that you don't wake up one day finding yourself isolated on your own island, but that you know who your peers are within your church? You reach out to other comms directors at other churches, or even in marketplace setting that can offer you wisdom and be someone else to bounce something off of. But I don't know, we were not wired to do it alone and figure it out alone. And so I would say just make sure you know who your people are and those safe places to process with. Especially when you're anticipating changes or, a course change.
That is so well said, especially that organizational history. I didn't really think of it that way. I thought of more the culture, but the organizational history is so critically important to that because you kind of know what got you up to this point as a church.
Yeah.
And your job isn't to step in and change everything.
Right.
It's to continue to carry the mission but you have to understand the history. That's really, really good. Because culture is obviously one of those things where there's that line between stepping in and just being absorbed into the culture, because then you may not be able to see what you do need to change because you're so sucked into it. But understand the history of it so that you can make some changes, good changes moving forward is pretty important.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I know that I've definitely stepped in it too, where you're like, oh, I didn't know that was a thing, or I didn't realize that was so important to so-and-so. And so the faster you also just get to know all the so-and-sos, then that also just helps bridge that gap. And so I know there are people on our leadership team that I've just walked in, and said, hey, I just need to process something with you. This feels like something you might care about, or you would have been a part of in the past. I just want to make sure I know all the things so we don't get it wrong, or we don't move too fast in one direction without honoring another direction. And so, that as many times as I could say I've gotten it right, there have definitely been times that you also get it wrong. And some of that you just live and you learn how to just develop those relationships better in the future.
Well, it's a lot easier and it's a lot easier to learn from our failures, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to learn from success because I don't know, it's successful, but when it's a failure, that's just my advice to everybody is always to fail forward.
Yep.
And because you're gonna, it's right? So
totally. I just like to do it with a couple of my friends too.
that's and you kind of said this a little bit, but who do you look to, or to help you do your job better? What your outlets? You kind of mentioned a little bit there, with your supervisor or some other comm directors. Where else are you getting inspiration?
Yeah. So I would say also just on our church team, I am very much in relationship with our student director, our kid director, our guest experience director, those that lead in our worship and arts department. And that is primarily so we can be thinking at a more higher strategic level than just within our own silos. If I woke up just thinking about communications every day, I'd be missing out on a lot of goodness that I could learn from my counterparts. And so I think that, again, that just visual of when you're working on an island, that's when things get weird. And so how do you know, even on your own church team, who are the right counterparts that can help you think, can help you process, but also that you can challenge and they can challenge you because you know that fundamentally you're all going after the same mission.
Yeah.
And then I would say also, just outside of my church team, we very much believe that we have so many gifts and talents within our church. And so there are definitely people even in our church that are, whether they're marketing professionals or designers or videographers or comms directors, our team is very used to also kind of having their people to even be connected with those that aren't on our church staff, but would love to serve or consult or talk through things with us. And yeah, it's interesting too, even with my like marketplace experience in retail management, I still have people from that world that it's like, hey, can I process this people problem with you? Or, this training thing that I'm feeling. Because fundamentally, a lot of it transfers, right? It's just a different craft that you're kind of transferring it under.
Yeah. And you mentioned something about a class that you guys you're jumping into a class where you're teaching or.
Yeah. So we have Develop, which is a 2-year leadership program. And so we have different tracks that you can jump into. And so one of the classes that cohort goes through is communicating to be heard. And so actually it's starting up here soon. And we go through crucial conversations. And I said this, you heard that, which is like all temperaments. And so kind of marrying that curriculum together. And so I love teaching it because I love the reminder every year that it's like, yes, these things are important and valuable, and kind of being able to brush up on it. But yeah, so those are 2 great resources as well. And then of course, our church participates in Global Leadership Summit. And so we have a lot of just content from those and that avenue. And so most of the people in that circuit, I'd say a lot of us also follow their work.
Yeah. Leadership. Love that. Yeah. The Leadership Summit's always a good one to go to.
Yeah.
Are there any books that you have read? You mentioned one, but are there any other books that have really helped define you in terms of how you're doing your job?
I feel like I should tell you yes, but I don't know that I have a ton of those. A couple of years ago, actually, as a team, we read Herding Tigers. I think it's Todd Henry. And that was really good for our team to even the way he describes like creative guardrails and like how to help creatives think. I know that there's a couple of us that follow his work more closely, just from the creative side. And then Creativity Inc. is another book that our team reads when they're kind of onboarding. And so much of that for me is I think it helps just set a high level of candor. And so if you're around our church, you'll hear we're a high feedback culture. And really at the end of the day, what that means is just like you should be able to have like just conversations with others around their ministry and what they're doing, knowing that, again, we're all on the same foundation of whether it's what our values look like or what our core looks like. And so how can you develop that high level of candor quickly to be able to put your personal preferences aside and remember, hey, we're all going after the mission together. This is not personal. This is how we live at our values.
Yeah. Oh, so good. So good. Joanna, how do people get in touch with you if they've got some questions? Because a lot of times our community wants to reach out and pick your brain. How would they get a hold of you?
Absolutely. So you can jump on our church website, lcbcchurch.com. You can find me on the team page. But otherwise, I'm on Instagram under Joanna Wishard or LinkedIn as well.
Okay. Well, thank you again for your time, your insight, your wisdom.
Yeah, thank you.
And your passion for what you do there. It's just evident, in just this short conversation that God is doing some really cool things through you, through the leadership, and through the congregation. Yeah. And what a cool place to be at, huh?
Yeah, thank you. This has been so fun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right. Well, take care.